Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, Energy Futures, How Can We Keep the Lights On? My name is Tony Gilland and I'm an Associate Fellow of the Industry of Ideas and delighted to be chairing this debate. I'd first like to thank PwC, who are the partners for the Megatrends strand, which this session is part of, and also very particularly to the Royal Academy of Engineering, who have supported this debate. Both organisations have been working with the Industry of Ideas for a number of years at the battle, and we really value their contribution. And I'm very pleased to have Alan Walker on the panel from the Royal Academy of Engineering. Okay, on to the subject matter. I think it needs little introduction. It's constantly in the headlines. We have a range of options: nuclear, gas, coal, wind, solar, and more recently, paying companies to down tools and stop using electricity if peak demand outstrips supply. Everyone agrees that we need a mix of energy sources, but no one seems to be willing to decide what the mix should be. So here to discuss this issue, we have an excellent panel, and the key question in my mind is prevarication holding back essential investment, and as some say, is it threatening blackouts in the future? Okay, our panel. In the order in which I'll speak, we first have Gemma Adams. Welcome to Gemma, who's on my far left. She's a principal advisor at the Forum for the Future, with a strong interest in disruptive innovations in the energy system and behaviour change. Next to speak on my immediate right, I'm very pleased to welcome Paul Eakins, who's Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy and Director of UCL's Institute for Sustainable Resources. He's also the Deputy Director of the UK's Energy Research Centre. So welcome to Paul. Then on my immediate left, Rob Lyons. He's a columnist for the online journal Spiked, described as sassy and irreverent magazine of news and opinion by the San Francisco Chronicle. So Rob, we're expecting plenty of sassy and irreverent opinions from yourself. He's also the author of the extremely humorously titled and excellent book, Panic on a Plate, How Society Developed an Eating Disorder. Next up we'll have Dr. Keith McLean on my far right, an independent energy advisor and industries chair of the Energy Research Partnership, and he's also worked for 20 years for one of the big six energy utilities, SSE, and therefore now that he's independent, no doubt will be able to share some insights with us, albeit having to perhaps be a little cautious. Finally, very pleased to have, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Alan Walker, who's the Head of Policy for the Royal Academy of Engineering, and he's worked on energy policy for almost a decade, authoring numerous reports. The speakers have approximately 5 minutes. They get a warning, an amber card when they have a minute left to go, and a red card for their final sentence, and that should allow us plenty of time for some interesting discussion with all of you in the audience. So, with no further ado, Gemma, please.
Hello. Hi everyone. So I'm coming to you today not as a technical expert in the energy space, but as someone that champions the energy consumer and the needs of all of us, and businesses, of course, who also consume energy in the future. I'm a doer in the energy space. I convene organisations like the National Grid and the Crown Estate and Cisco and Sky and O2 and Which, different organisations that have a vested interest in the energy system to try and build a better future. So I'm a doer and I'm a champion of the consumer in this whole debate and on this panel today. The organisation I work for is called Forum for the Future, and we want to see an energy future that is everything. We want it all. We want a system that's secure, we want a system that's low carbon, we want a system that's cheap. And the debate is not just about our lights, of course. What we pay for our energy, the availability of energy, affects all aspects of our life. It affects what we pay for our food, it affects what we pay for essentials, it affects our pensions, it affects our disposable income and the way we live our lives. So it's important that we get this right. The trouble is that the future we're entering into is a lot more uncertain than our past. We have issues like resource scarcity, which hasn't been a problem. We're hitting up against the limits of available metals and the limits with which natural systems can renew themselves, and this poses new problems for us. So what we need is new thinking, new questions, new solutions. So I want to put a series of slightly different questions back to frame the debate today. We need to think about how we don't just bring on new energy supply to deal with these challenges in the future. We need to think about how we're removing that need, how we're consuming energy differently and less to avoid the need to bring on carbon-intensive new forms of energy generation. We need to align energy load with generation much more carefully and much more cleverly than we have done in the past. We also need to look at what some of the conditions for change are, and specifically what some of the blockers to innovation are. And I spend quite a lot of my time considering and working with our partners to deal with the fact that the big 6 energy companies are so dominant in the market and have such a vested interest in continuing business as usual. It makes it very difficult for change to happen. So how do we unblock the hold that the big incumbent energy companies have on maintaining the system that we have, which isn't fit for the future? And the good news is that there are a lot of new solutions at our disposal. We have a digital revolution underway. I and my organisation are very interested in how we can use digital to disrupt and to create change. So, you've probably heard of Tesla over in the US, in the process of opening a gigafactory in Nevada that is going to manufacture different forms of batteries that will disrupt our ability to store energy as consumers on the grid. They're going, by producing vast numbers of different forms of batteries, they're going to be reducing the price, and that's going to have a dramatic effect on our ability to use renewable energy, for example, which obviously has a much more sort of up and down formats to generation. Organisations like SolarZyme are using algae to manufacture diesel, which also feeds into the energy system. Obviously, there's a huge debate about GMO and about synthetic biology, and we're looking quite seriously at some of the potential negative downsides of that. But we need to take a view looking at biological innovation and the role that that can play in energy solutions too. And then there are organisations like O-Power, which you might be familiar with here. They've got quite a strong international presence now, that are working with energy consumers to make smarter decisions about how much energy they use and when they use their energy, and are rolling out a series of smart thermostats that will allow them to work with consumers to regulate energy use and to use energy much more sparingly in the home. So what I want to put to you today is that our debate about keeping the lights on is not purely about generation, it's about looking at a variety of different solutions. And it's also about looking at how we consume energy. We are launching a project, or we will be launching a project very soon, that wants to create a virtual power station. We want to build a power station, or the equivalent of a power station, through working with an organisation called Open Energy that turns off, for example, Tesco's fridges at different points in the day to smooth out load to avoid the need for bringing on an additional coal-fired power station. Those sorts of solutions are available to us. They're just very, very niche at the moment. So the challenge is how we can scale these solutions up to the point that we can meet some of the challenges that we're facing.
Thank you, Gemma. Marvellous. So next up we have Paul, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for coming. It's an important topic. How do we keep the lights on? It's not a technical problem. We know how to keep the lights on technically. We've been doing it for decades. If there is a problem, it's an economic problem and particularly a political problem. And I just want to set out the parameters of that. The current situation is that between anticipated peak demand in winter and maximum projected supply, there is only likely to be about 5% over the next couple of winters, in a historical situation where we've had 20%. So it's decreased substantially. Economically, that's good, because it's obviously costly to keep a lot of plant lying idle the whole time, but obviously that increases the risks of power not being available when we want it. The margin can be increased through demand management, as indeed was said right at the beginning by Tony. by large consumers agreeing to be switched off when the going gets tough, and for that they get a lower power price. So that's their own decision, they go into that, and then if they have to get switched off they can't complain because they'll be getting the electricity that much cheaper. In my view, the demand curtailment of others, like us at home, over the next couple of winters, the chances of that are pretty small. But they're larger than they were. And it could occur through a combination of very cold weather, very still weather, so that the large number of wind farms that we have are not producing, and large power stations going offline. And that's what all the problem and the concern is about. And it's come about because, as Gemma said, we want it all. And unfortunately, in the real world, we can't always have it all the time. We want cheap energy. Well, the cheapest energy sources are coal or gas, depending on the relative prices. We want secure energy, and the secure sources of energy are coal, gas, and nuclear. And that's the mix that we've had for the last 30 or 40 years, and the lights have stayed on. Unfortunately, coal and gas produce carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are changing the climate, and the prognosis for the future is potentially catastrophic due to climate change. And I want to emphasize that because that is the scientific view of these matters. And the government therefore wants to get rid of carbon emissions, and that's where the problems start. Low carbon energy sources exist, but they are not as cheap as coal and gas. Certainly at the moment, it would be very surprising if they were. They're new industries, whereas the coal and gas power sectors have been developed over many decades. So onshore wind is the next cheapest, nuclear is probably the next cheapest, offshore wind is the most expensive, with photovoltaic cells coming up fast on the inside, huge cost reductions over the last 10 years, but still probably as expensive as nuclear to the retailer. What's more, you will have noticed that the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. These are intermittent energy sources, and we want it all. We want power when we want it. We don't want it when the wind blows. And that means that these renewables have to be backed up by other power stations, which are normally gas, but can also be coal. And the power generators have to be paid for this. And these may be power stations that don't work for more than 2 weeks a year, but over those 2 weeks a year, somehow they have to be paid enough to build a large power station, keep it functional, so that it comes on, boom, when we want it, in the middle of winter, when it's cold. There's a problem with nuclear, not just that it's expensive, and we now know how expensive it is, because all that's come out in the open through these, the recent arrangements, but these nuclear stations are very large. They're rather inflexible. It's not easy to ramp them up and put them down. That means that when lots of people come on to the electricity system at the same time, well, then you need other kinds of power stations. And also, if they go offline for servicing, and one of the problems with this winter is that a couple of our nuclear power stations look as if they may be about to go offline, then obviously you have a potential problem. We could sort all this if there were political agreement about the direction to go in. Unfortunately, there isn't. 5 years ago, there was something resembling political agreement. People were prepared to pay the costs of low carbon. People could see that that would need certain forms of generation. But the low carbon consensus has become much more challenged. Only 3 MPs voted against the Climate Change Act. My estimate would be it would now be about 100. So you can see it's still a significant majority in favour of the low carbon position, but it's eroding. And then we've had shale gas come on the scene, another very controversial issue, which has further muddied the water about the direction the UK energy sector is going to take. Finally, there's the demonisation of the big 6 retailers, and these were the companies that were expected to put up the large part of 100 to 200 billion that we need to keep the lights on, and that's not a very good environment to expect them to do that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, now for the sassy and irreverent. Not that that wasn't irreverent or sassy, but as advertised.
Academics don't do sassy and irreverent.
Rob Lyons.
I'm sorry I didn't bring my feather boa, and I haven't got a musical number for you tonight. I mean, other people have said, I don't think there's much danger of domestic users' lights going out this winter or next, despite some of the talk in the press and despite the dog's dinner that's been made of energy policy over the past decade or two. But there are plenty of ways in which National Grid can muddle through to keep our lights on, even if it means that workplaces might have to have their power switched off or turned down for a bit, or we bring relatively high cost, keep a few old coal and gas stations on the back burner. However, the fact that we're even discussing these things is a sign of how badly energy policy has been dealt with in the past few years, and this probably is where I would have a different emphasis from Paul, because I think that part of that has been a panicky response to climate change specifically, and to sort of environmental concerns more generally. And I think, for me, there's the holy trinity of our energy system, which kind of Gemma sort of alluded to, perhaps with a different membership of the holy trinity, I don't know. First, we want reliability. We want power to be available to us whenever we want it. In turn, that we need security of supply, that we're not overly reliant on one form of energy if we can avoid it. So we don't want to be entirely reliant on gas, nuclear or coal in case there's any supply problems or a general problem, like for example, as you saw in Japan where they switched off their nuclear power stations after Fukushima. That kind of black swan moment can come along, so you want diversity of supply. Secondly, we want abundance. We don't want our ambitions about how society might develop in the future to be stifled because we haven't planned to produce enough energy. And that's even more serious when we look on a global scale in terms of what a lack of energy can mean. So according to the UN, almost 3 billion people rely on traditional biomass for cooking and heating. About 1.5 billion have no access to electricity, and another billion on top of that have access only to unreliable electricity networks. That's a massive amount of people who need to be brought safe, reliable energy. But even in the developed world, there are ways in which we could take advantage of having greater access to energy, whether it's high-speed transport, desalination plants in water-stressed areas. If we want 2050, the world in 2050 to look very different from the world in 2014, and I hope we have that ambition, then we're going to need a lot more energy. And thirdly, we need to cut the cost of energy. Not only do we want to reverse that trend for higher fuel bills for domestic users, but cheap electricity is essential to open up the possibilities I've just mentioned. And expensive energy might be the difference between implementing innovations and not innovating at all. However, I think into that mix has come, I think, an overblown, or at least a concern with the environment that's like, as I said, slightly panicky. It's like wanting to deal with the issue too quickly and not realise this is going to be a long game. That's not to say that climate change isn't a problem. I think it's been exaggerated quite a lot of the time, but policy has been to push ahead with introducing renewables at the expense of fossil fuels, I think far too quickly. And it's worth bearing in mind just how good fossil fuels are and what a serious barrier they are to implementing other kinds of innovation. Coal, for example, is stable, cheap, flexible, dense source of energy that's widely distributed throughout the world. That's why the big push for countries like China and India to produce more energy is built on coal-fired power stations predominantly. Oil, to illustrate, oil, a bottle this size of oil will move my 1.5, 2-ton car with 4 passengers and luggage for about 5 or 6 miles, which is kind of an astonishing thing when you think about it. We're just kind of completely used to that being the case. Oil will continue to power most transport for decades to come. According to the International Energy Agency, even with a strong push on renewables, the share of fossil fuels in world energy usage will only fall from 82% today to about 75% in 2035. So we will have a lot more renewables in the future, but the total demand for energy will increase so much that the percentage will still stay quite high for fossil fuels. Now, I don't have any principal objection to any particular kind of energy production. I just want it to fit my holy trinity of cheapness, abundance and reliability. Where renewables are already cost competitive with fossil fuels, we should of course use them. So for example, if you're in a hot climate with lots of spare land, a desert that's not being much used for anything else, and your peak demand is when all the air conditioning is on, then solar, for example, is a very good fit. Other environmental concerns have exacerbated the situation as well. Germany's decision to close all its nuclear power plants after Fukushima is a backward step, I think, and ironically they're replacing the nuclear with coal, it would seem, and possibly the dirtiest form of coal as well. Japan replaced nuclear essentially with gas. In the UK, we've prevaricated about nuclear for a long time. We rejected it for an awfully long time. Then we said, oh, right, you can build it, but we're not going to give you any subsidies for it. And eventually, we've got this really, really terrible deal on Hinkley Point C, where we're agreed to pay an absolute fortune for energy for the next 35 years. But that was because of the prevarication left the government in a very weak negotiating position. So we should be more calm. When other sources of energy can reasonably meet the criteria of that holy trinity, then they can be very useful indeed. And the coal and oil will stay in the ground when we have better alternatives.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, and everyone's obeying the cards. It's marvellous. Let's see if that can continue. Right, moving on then to Keith McLean, please.
Thanks very much. I think everybody's been agreed pretty much so far that having a debate about keeping the lights on isn't necessarily helpful, and it's been used quite a lot in a rather scaremongering way. Certainly in the shorter term, that's not going to be the issue, unless we have catastrophic failures generally of the wires rather than of the generating system, or some big mistake that National Grid makes by pressing the wrong button somewhere. But most of the impact, if there are going to be issues, and I do think over the next few winters there's quite a big risk of there being issues, most of the impact is going to be felt by industry. And although in some ways that's reassuring for householders, it's not actually a particularly good thing to be happening just as we're getting industry recovering and when we want them to be generating more business and more jobs. But in the longer term, clearly we do need to get on with replacing the old system, whether it's because it's not working anymore, or because it's inefficient, or because we need to move to a low-carbon future. And we've been rather spoilt over recent decades because we've lived off a very healthy margin that was created by the nationalised industries and the overinvestment that there was there, followed by the dash for gas, which came on and was turned off and then came back on again. And that gave us a very healthy margin. But looking forward, we certainly can't be complacent about keeping that. And we really need to start now thinking seriously about how we're going to create that stable system to support our business and domestic use. But a lot of what's happening at the moment is driven by subsidy and intervention. Despite pretense that we're letting the market decide, that is not what is happening at all. We're seeing now a situation where we have more state control and state intervention about what's happening than we ever did in the days of the CEGB. But we don't have the opposite, the sort of counterbalance to that of a chief engineer who stands up and says to the Secretary of State, that's a bloody awful idea, that is not going to work. Because we now have fragmented industry which isn't able to produce that counterbalance, and that's actually a very dangerous place to be in. And the idea that there isn't a plan in place is also rather disingenuous, because whatever you try to do, it's like having an invisible force field somewhere that you start moving, and the only time that you know you've actually reached the limit is when you smash your head against it and do an awful lot of damage. So you start investing in a solar industry, and then suddenly the government says, oh, well, actually, that's more solar than we want, so we're going to stop that. Onshore wind's doing rather well at the moment, so we're going to change the planning rules, and you can't do that. E.ON wants to do a new coal plant. Oh, well, we'll have to change the planning rules to do that. So these are all things that happen once a lot of money is invested, and we're wasting an awful lot of money pretending that we don't have a plan. So we need to move from an implicit plan that's there at the moment to a more explicit one. Although the solution going forward really to get out of this horrible messy middle that we're in at the moment, where we're neither in a regulated world nor in a proper market world, would be to go back to one of the extremes or the other. And I think going back to letting the market decide, which it never really has, probably isn't going to be the right answer at the moment. So I think we just have to accept the need for some form of explicit central plan, which doesn't mean there isn't then a role for market. We're saying let the state decide, but we're saying let the market and let industry deliver. And that's something that industry is good at. Industry is generally, in the private sector, far more efficient at procurement, at construction, and at operation. And as long as there's a clear framework and a clear idea of what's needed, then they can actually get on with that. We saw, there was no problem with the Olympic Games. We didn't say, right, well, we'll let the market decide when that's going to be, in which country or which city, and which way around the athletes are going to run on the track and then change halfway around. We said very clearly when, where, and had all of that, and industry was able to deliver on time, on budget against that. And that's where we really need to get to in the energy system, because we forget really just how central energy has become to absolutely everything we do. And if we sleepwalk into a situation where we haven't got time anymore to make the investment and to make it work, then that really is going to have serious implications.
Thank you. Finally, Alan, please.
Thank you very much. Going last, I wasn't sure how much of my notes I'd still be left with. I think I certainly agree with the vast majority of what's been said by the rest of the panel so far, maybe one or two sort of differences. The way we see it is, so the Royal Academy of Engineering did a report about a year ago on will the lights go out, and we concluded that, to read from it, there are a number of market-based and political factors that are currently combining to bring about a reduction in capacity margin that would reduce this in a manner that would present an increasing risk to security of supply. Wordy way of saying things could be getting a bit bad if we don't do something about it. We recommend that the interim measures get brought in until you can put it in a capacity market to actually pay for capacity to be on the system. Both of those things have now happened, and I think because those have happened, as the rest of the panel have said, we are probably not in a situation where anything's going to go seriously wrong in the short term, unless there is a confluence of a number of events, which, as Paul said, it's a big high pressure system that give you very cold weather, low wind conditions, plant outages, and possibly some sort of effects with interconnectors on the continent. But there's always a risk of those sorts of things. The danger is if you allow those risks to continue for year after year, the chances of them happening become compounded and much more likely. So we're very pleased that sort of mechanisms and measures have been brought in to hopefully get us through that short term. The big problem, and this comes back to what the Chair sort of said, is prevarication delaying investment? And I say yes, it absolutely has. No question about that. We had 2-3 years to get through an energy bill to redesign the market in such a way, and everyone investing in new plant had to wait to see what happened with that, what the details would be before they would be able to. Since then, political sort of differences. The real unfortunate thing is it seems that energy is becoming a political football for the next election, and that is just so unhelpful. This is, as everyone says, energy is so important for our society. All the assets you're talking about, a nuclear plant could last 50 or 60 years. Even the shortest lived things like turbines, wind turbines, are still 25 years. Many political terms. So we really can't be, it should not be allowed to be a political football, and there should be consensus on the way forward, which brings into Keith's point about a central plan that industry then delivers. And I think I certainly would support that idea. The basic system, looking at it more generally, you have the supply side and the demand side, and again, as Gemma said, so far it's always been a very passive system. People switch things on, something else switches on to supply it. A very passive one-way system. That has to become more dynamic and much smarter, and there are a lot of things happening that Gemma's covered very well. The trouble with that is we're learning. This is a really massive change that we're talking about. The smart sort of grid, the smart technologies, the different tariffs that might come in, these are all new things, and we need time to slowly bring them on and integrate them. Paul sort of said it's not a technical problem, it's an economic and political problem. I would agree that we have the technology to move forward to a system that would deliver what we want, but it's challenging, it's most definitely challenging. I obviously have faith in engineers to be able to deliver that, but it won't happen overnight, and also, you know, mistakes may well be made, and we need to learn from those. That's particularly true on the demand side. There's a lot to learn on that. The possibilities are almost endless, but it's going to be a challenge to deliver. Talking about, Rob had his, what did he call it? Holy Trinity. The standard way we talk about this is the trilemma of cost security and decarbonisation. That's the goal that we have. Trouble is that these things are, you know, there's a lot of tension between them. I think it's correct to say that we have focused probably a bit too much in the last few years on decarbonisation. And the trouble with this trilemma is if you focus on one, forget the other two, they will come back to bite you. And that has most certainly happened. Security of supply has started to reduce, and we've had to sort of run fairly quickly, bring in sort of interim measures to sort that out. And the costs, obviously, everybody sort of can see that in the news numerous times. The costs are going up, and people aren't happy to pay. So the last two recommendations we had in our report was that we need to develop a holistic energy strategy. This isn't just electricity, this is heat, and this is transport, this is industry. It's all interlinked, and too much they're kept separate. This is something of government sort of thing, different departments, but you have to look at them as a whole system. And we also need an honest and open debate from all the players, from government, from users, from industry. We all have to be moving in the same direction, and in a sense that's one of the reasons we're very happy to be here today to sort of carry on that debate. So,
great. Thank you. And thanks to all of our speakers. Right, lots to get stuck into. I just want to throw a couple of quick questions to the panel and allow them to also comment on what each other said before I'm going to come out to the audience in a maximum of 10 minutes. So I think, Keith, you raised the Central Electricity Generating Board, if I get the acronym correct, of old, and you argued that now, actually, there's even more state intervention. It's just implicit, not explicit. But Gemma mentioned the big six blocking innovation. So my question to the panel is, well, where would you put your emphasis? You know, big six, nobody else really commented on them. They are seen, certainly in the media, and many of the public probably are very suspicious about how they operate and whether they're gaming and playing the market. So I want to sort of hear some more comments on the big six from the rest of the panel. But I'm really interested in this question of prevarication, because it's one thing to argue we need an explicit state framework within which industries can operate, but why have politicians found it so difficult to decide what that policy should be? Because it's not just it's implicit, it's not clear what it should be, because they keep, I think it was Keith made the point, keep changing the goalposts. So 1 minute solar, next minute wind, all these investment questions thrown up in the air again. Why have politicians found it so difficult to come up with a clear policy framework? Big six, I'm going to go to Gemma first, since you haven't had a chance to speak for a while. So you leave the big six for the moment, because you made that point. For you, the question about, you know, state intervention and prevarication.
I guess, working for a sustainability charity, I guess that the angle I can take on that is the confusion around the UK's sustainability strategy and around the arrangements, the strong framework, or rather the lack of strong framework that's been put in place to deal with climate change. I was actually doing a piece of work with the Cabinet Office at the point that the new administration came in. We were halfway through doing a really substantive piece of work looking at government procurement and making that far more futuristic in the approach it took to looking at the impacts of certain decisions on jobs and on health and well-being and those sorts of things. And when the new administration came in, all of that stuff literally just went out of the window within a split second. And we had a vacuum of about a year with nothing to replace it. And then what did replace it was a very shonky, unclear, and a direction that I don't think has supported investment in low carbon technologies.
Can I just push on that, Gemma, because you presented it as a shift in government, but actually across the world, the whole issue around decarbonisation has slipped down the agenda massively. And it's not an issue that I think the old administration or the Labour Party are massively campaigning on. So is it really just a shift of government? It seems to be a much wider phenomena than that. You know, the emphasis on decarbonisation, now there's an ambiguity probably across the world.
Yeah, I think my take on that was, at the time, I think it was absolutely about shifting government. I think what's happened is because the global economy has hit a rocky patch, because we've been going through a protracted period of low growth, I think that's taken people's attention. Climate change affects our economy, it affects the quality of growth and quality of growth. You know, the extent to which economic growth can deliver well-being, happiness, all the things that actually matter to us. That's where climate change hits. But it's a long playing out issue. It's a pretty uncomfortable concept. We don't want to face something as big and hairy and scary as that. And I think that's basically what's happened. I think the economy's taken precedence. But I spend a lot of my time looking at the future. A lot of the way I work is looking at how future trends will play out. We can't afford not to act on climate change. The question is not whether to act, the question is when. And the longer we wait for that to happen, the more painful the process is going to be, and the deeper the impact will be on the quality of growth that's happened.
Okay, Paul, if I could turn to you, quick reflections on what Gemma's just said, and in particular, Rob said that we've had a panicky response to climate change that has made our decisions more difficult. So any views on that sort of climate change aspect of it, and then I really want to know what you think about the Big Six.
Yeah, well, it's nice when people disagree with each other on a panel like this, and I disagree with Rob on the subject of panic about as strongly as it is possible to imagine. Firstly, we have set out a programme going forward through the Climate Change Act of 40 years through to 2050 to reduce emissions by 80%, which is the minimum we will need to meet any of the targets that the climate scientists say are essential to reduce the probability of catastrophic climate change to kind of levels that they feel comfortable about recommending. Now, 40 years doesn't sound to me like panic, but we have to start now because the energy system is a Titanic of a system. It takes time to turn it round. Huge investments are required, huge changes in the shape of markets, and we have to start doing those things now through price signals, which make electricity more expensive, and through regulations, which make markets more complicated. Now, I want to concentrate on this panic thing, because if you were living in the Philippines at Hurricane Haiyan, you wouldn't feel that you were panicking about climate change. If you were in New York at Hurricane Sands, you weren't feeling about the panic of climate change. Those are the things which the scientists say will happen more often and with more intensity if we allow carbon emissions to continue to grow unabated. And at the moment, carbon emissions are growing faster than they've ever grown before, and the concentrations in the atmosphere are going faster. This is a short-term, long-term thing. I'm not worried about myself, actually. I'm an old man, and I shall be well dead and gone by the time this stuff hits the fan. But it is coming on the basis of all the best science that we know. And I'd like to use a kind of folksy analogy. If you as an individual feel something's wrong with you, and you go to a doctor, and you say, doctor, I've got these symptoms, what's wrong with me? And the doctor gives you an opinion, and you think, well, I'll go and get another opinion. So you get another opinion. And these are all fully paid up doctors. They're on the General Medical Council. These are the scientifically accredited body for this kind of problem. And you go to 100 doctors, and 95 of them give you the same diagnosis and the same prescription. And 5 of them give you a range of different diagnoses, and a few of them, say 3, say, don't worry, old son, it'll be okay, don't panic. With your health at stake as an individual, what are you going to do? And I'll just leave that with you. Because the climate change is exactly similar in terms of the proportion of climate scientists and those who will give you that kind of analysis.
And can I just get a really brief word so I can go to somebody else on Big Six blocking innovation?
Yeah, the Big Six is a fascinating issue, and I've tried to understand it. It's unbelievably complicated, so it's very difficult to understand. There is this dynamic with these 6 big companies and the regulator, and they work together, not in necessarily a bad way, but in the way that the regulations and the government legislation which has been set up, which have allowed these companies to emerge, in the way that that kind of has to work. Ofgem itself, the regulator, has carried out 2 analyses that have looked to see whether the market is operating as it should, and when I say as it should, I mean as is envisaged in the regulations. And both those investigations, on both occasions, have said that there is no evidence of bad behaviour on any of the Big Six. Now, we now know that the Competition Markets Authority is going to be looking at this, and it will be looking over a wider remit. It will certainly come to the conclusion that we don't have a competitive market, but then no country has a competitive electricity market. Whether it comes to the conclusion that the Big Six have been acting in an uncompetitive way that is effectively illegal is not for me to say, and I shall look forward to their conclusions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Right, Alan, your turn.
Pick up on a couple of those. Okay, why is the market not delivering now? If you go back to sort of pre-2000, when the need for decarbonisation wasn't there. If you go back to not a trilemma but a dilemma of secure and affordable, we got very good at that. Now, you can argue about the pros and cons of privatisation or nationalisation, but CGB and the private sector were very effective at delivering that fairly efficiently. Once decarbonisation came in, it just got so much harder. The reason it's so much harder is because carbon is an externality. It's not within the market. So, and that's what Nicholas Stern showed in his economic review. So, the market really struggles to deliver a low carbon system because the market doesn't really see carbon, which meant you had to try to bring in these sort of incentives or disincentives for either pushing low carbon renewable or disincentivizing coal and gas. But those are patches on the market. They're not fundamental to the market.
Do you think there's a political ambiguity there, that actually politicians are not clear which way they want to go?
So the trouble was when you had just the secure and affordable, the government suddenly realised we don't need to deal with this. It's, you know, the industry is doing that better than we possibly could. Now when carbon comes in an industry in a sense can't do that, government have been running mad to actually figure out how to do this. They don't want to go back to the situation of sort of command central. They don't want to do that. They've actually sort of stated that the current reforms are leading to hopefully...
But why don't you want to do that? Is it actually an evasion of responsibility?
I have to ask a politician.
You couldn't possibly tell it.
It's hard. On the Big Six, you know, I feel a bit sorry for the Big Six. I think they've been demonised probably unfairly. I don't think it's a cartel. I think it is true that they are just better able to deal with the mixture and uncertainty of the political sort of system that's come through. Any changes, they might not like them, but they're probably better able to cope with them than small companies. The vertical integration, sort of from generation through to retail, makes them a bit more sort of hardened to changes. A small solar company, for example, suddenly the fits get taken away. That's their only business, they're out of business. Whereas a big six has a much wider portfolio, and that's why they grow and are able to defend themselves much better. It's fairly natural. You look across other sectors, cars, supermarkets, banks, there's always a fairly small number of big players.
Great, thank you. I'm really going to get out of the audience, so just very brief comments, if I may, from Rob and Keith, and then I'll bring you back further in the discussion. But Rob, your reflections on this question, but also on the demand management thing, whether you actually think that's got some potential.
I'll leave that for a moment.
You'll leave that.
A moment. On the big six, I mean, if you just to take a step back from it, any industry that is as capital intensive as energy, that has 6 big players in it, is a pretty good market as it goes. So I don't have any worries from that. And if you look at other sort of measures of this thing, are UK energy prices a lot higher than the rest of Europe? No, it's towards the bottom thirds generally in terms of prices. Are they making excessive margins? No, not really. I mean, again, in terms of the capital involved in energy, I don't think the big six are particularly monopolistic in that respect. In terms of what Keith was talking about earlier, I think is absolutely right in terms of the jumping around and the uncertainty, the expense that uncertainty creates, is that if something like Hinkley Point C, where we've signed up to double the current price of electricity for the next 35 years, the reason that price has had to be paid is because the generator's saying, we are not going to commit this amount of capital to something unless we're absolutely guaranteed you're not going to move the goalposts again. And Ed Miliband coming out and saying we'll freeze energy prices is about the stupidest thing he could have done in that context. So I agree with Alan. I think that the big six have been demonised. On the panicky response, I'll take Paul up a little bit later on the climate change stuff.
Right, thanks. Keith, a couple of quick points.
Yeah, okay. Just on the innovation point, I think it's one of the things I still do is chair the Energy Research Partnership, which looks across the energy innovation investment on the public and private sector in the UK. And what's absolutely clear there is that if you're trying to innovate, you need to innovate into something where you understand what the direction of travel is. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult. So the first thing to suffer in the uncertainty, the first thing to suffer when somebody threatens to turn the tap off at source for income, is to stop innovating. The last thing that you start investing again is innovation. So at the moment we're in a really bad position that the innovation spending in the industry, from an industry perspective, rather than what's driven by regulation or public sector, is very, very difficult to do, for all the reasons I outlined earlier. And this difficulty that was mentioned about an incoherent policy framework, why is that coming about? Well, just look, for instance, at the way the organisations, whether it's the politicians or the officials, are organised. They have such short tenure in their jobs. We run out of fingers to count the number of energy ministers there have been over the last decade. And the number of secretaries of state has changed. And if you look at the length of period that a civil servant works on a particular area of policy, and even that's in a silo, it can often be as little as 6 months, or to find somebody who's been there doing the same job for years is really unusual. If you tried to run a business like that, changing your senior staff over, your senior engineers and everybody within a 6 to 9 month schedule, your business would be ruined. So it's actually not surprising that with that approach to managing something like energy, which should be over decades, not over months or a few years. So we have an institutional problem at the heart of all of this, which means that we will get short-termism rather than long-termism. And the only ray of hope that I had was listening to the energy minister the other day, who said something really sensible, which was that pound for pound spent on innovation is far better value for consumers than pound spent on subsidy. And at the moment we're trying to do everything with subsidies and interventions rather than on encouraging innovation with the same amount of money.
Great, thanks very much, Keith. Right, your turn. I'm sure there's, yeah, absolutely brilliant. So we're going to get plenty of comments in, so panel, please note down points so that you don't forget them. I'll start at the back. There's a gentleman sitting on the floor in the green top, and I'll try and get as many people as possible. Yeah.
Hi. So I want to make 2 points. Firstly, about the big six, and I think one problem that you haven't addressed is that the big energy companies are fundamentally have a lot of inertia. For them, often it's cheaper to pay lobbyists to weaken legislation than it is to pay people to innovate, which is why they shut down all their R&D departments when they were privatized. So Paul made the point that so far no evidence of collusion has appeared, but they do lobby. What direction are they lobbying? And I think that's something I'd like you to consider. And the second point is more about the time horizon. So again, Paul, you mentioned that we have a very long-term climate change act. So you mentioned 40 years until 2050. It's now 35 years, actually. And for people like me, 2050 is not the distant future. 2050 is my future. For people who are now just entering university, they're 18, they expect to be pretty much in their prime in 2050. And so I kind of wanted to ask you to consider how this impacts on your opinions for the future.
Thank you very much. If you can put your hands up, I'm going to work from the back to the front, or I might dot it around a bit, but there's another gentleman at the back, very back there, yeah.
Thanks very much. I think this is a really interesting discussion, so thanks to you all for that. You've all contributed. I think Paul has inadvertently stumbled across the difficulty that renewable enthusiasm has at the moment, because he said that the scientists must tell us what the politics is. When you speak to climate scientists, they're much more subtle and ambivalent about the spread of risks than Paul made out. It's certainly not as clear-cut as medical advice. And when a politician says we need a 2-degree target, well, that 2-degree target was arbitrarily plucked out of the air. That is a political goal. Now, ultimately, politics comes down to your own ethical judgments. Mine would be, why should poor people not have access to electricity or cheap electricity? If you think we should have deindustrialisation, that's yours. You're welcome to that opinion, but it is fundamentally politics. So I'd like you to comment on that. Secondly, I've occasionally covered the energy market myself as a journalist, and it's extremely fast-moving and very difficult to keep track of things. Nobody had heard of shale gas 5 years ago. This week, Owen Patterson was talking about CHP, modular nukes, which I'm really pleased to hear. And that really changes some of the fundamentals. So some of the assumptions about nuclear, I think, I'd really love to hear your experts' view on what the costings of this.
Okay, thanks so much. Now, coming to the middle, anyone in the middle? The gentleman has his hand up quite a long time in the blue jacket.
Yeah, I'd just like to raise maybe a controversial issue. I take entirely what Gemma and Paul said. I mean, there are problems confronting society, but some are bigger than others. And there's one enormous problem confronting us. So Gemma made the point that we tend to ignore it. It's a very difficult problem to confront. And we ignore it because other smaller problems, like the state of the economy, take their place. And I'm a bit worried about this debate, because this debate seems to be focused on how can we effectively increase the energy that we use. Maybe that's the wrong question to ask. I grew up in a home without electricity. I don't remember that being a particular problem. It was rather fun going to bed with a candle at night. I also spent a lot of time in the Philippines where we have constant brownouts. Again, it's not a big deal. You know, to stop the electricity in the homes is not a great tragedy. And it's to take the position that Rob does, you know, let's have a few more power stations in order to keep the lights on. I think it's just disgraceful. It's a way of avoiding the basic issues, and we too easily avoid the basic issues.
Thanks very much. And if we could take it to the front, please. I'll come back to you. Sorry, I missed you.
Well, I disagree with that last comment, because I've also experienced blackouts in the country where I live, in Italy, and yeah, it's not good. And firstly, you know, talking about the intervention of the state, they stopped companies from working and then to keep the lights on in people's homes. And this happened in Italy after the closure of the nuclear industry in the late 1980s, after the Chernobyl accident. And I give the example not to kind of shock the panel into what might happen, but as you said, the gap is narrow now. And I think there are serious problems problems happening throughout Europe, which can learn from this lesson. I think the points that were made about Germany is now making very similar mistakes, as was described on the panel, in the aftermath of Fukushima. And Italian electricity was the most expensive in Europe. Now German electricity is the most expensive in Europe. And there seems to be a lot of reliance on France, whether it's with the new nuclear plant in the UK or in other parts of Europe, in Germany and Italy too. But the French nuclear industry is also ageing and has a lot of reactors that need replacing, and the investment hasn't been done there. So to come back to the kind of question that was raised here, you know, it seems that things are very kind of reactionary. There's a lot of reactions to kind of nuclear accidents, a lot of kind of reacting to short-term data on climate change, and a lack of kind of long-term strategy, which is not just about climate change, it's also about engineers, investment. I don't think climate change is the same as planning for an energy future. I think those two things are connected, but they're not the same thing. I just wonder whether the role of the European Union is influential here, and particularly the fact that you know, the target was introduced for 2020 to source 20% of energy in every EU country from renewable sources. And then, you know, just over the last year, we've seen a stepping back from that, that shouldn't be mandatory. How can we expect individual European countries to have a long-term strategy when there's no leadership at the European level?
Great, thanks. I'll take this gentleman here in the jacket, and then I'll bring the panel back, and then I'll come back out and get everybody else in.
Thanks very much. I first of all wanted to support the idea of holistic energy policy. I think integration with transport, if cars are going to be electric, most of the batteries are going to be in cars, so actually matching those two together. And I thought Paul's point about when you consult the experts, you often consult the doctors, and a similar idea consulting the climate experts, but doctors are often wrong. I can think of two particular cases where the majority view around ulcers and prion-type diseases, where it was very much a minority view that they were organism-caused, one bacterium and one of a protein. People couldn't believe proteins could be infectious. It went against the grain. So, the question I have is, what happens if the current climate view and the impact of CO2 isn't quite as bad, or in fact isn't there at all to this type of policy? What is the downside risk, really? And I think we need to look at that. I'm not saying, you know, I don't believe in the climate policy, but we need to bear that in mind in the energy policy.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So a few comments from the panel, then we'll go back out to the audience again. I'll take Keith and Rob first, because they had like most time before. Keith.
Okay, a very quick canter through lobbyists and vested interests. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a vested interest. Vested interests show that it matters to you. Generally, it shows that you understand what you're involved with, and I think putting that point of view across and informing others is important. I think you can always argue about what the direct response or reward for doing that is, but as I say, if you're seeing a reward and a benefit in what's happening, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. With regard to the question of whether we should increase the use of what we're doing, I think it's very different between electricity and heat. I think electricity, the utility value that we get out of electricity and the additional value that we get out of electricity is enormous. What we don't get a lot of value out of is completely wasting so much of the energy that's produced through drafty homes and poorly insulated homes. That is a total waste. And if we could focus all of the energy efficiency debate on an investment in the building infrastructure in the UK, which is ashamedly at a very, very low position in the league across developed nations, I think that would be the most sensible focus of our energy efficiency debate. I think the role of the EU is important. I do think they can provide a leadership role. They can actually provide a lightning rod or a scapegoat that makes it a bit easier for politicians here to agree. If you look at some of the most effective regulations that there have been on things like incandescent light bulbs and replacing those and other standards that have been rolled out, they've made a big difference. And the politicians here don't need to worry about it because there's always Brussels to blame. Then finally, the question about the downside risks of investing. A lot of what is being done with low carbon technologies like wind and solar makes a hell of a lot of sense in other ways too. If we are going to look at energy security, then think about fuel security. If we don't need to import all the fossil fuels, which we generally do nowadays, then we're making ourselves much more secure. If we have a free fuel, once we've made that initial investment, then we know exactly how much energy is going to cost us for the next 20 or 30 years. We're removing a volatility and an uncertainty that we currently have, both at a business and a domestic level. So far from actually there necessarily being a downside risk, we should actually look at the upside elements of what we can get. And this is where you can get a win-win-win, but if you're working within the trilemma, you've got to work down hard to make sure that you get into that sweet spot and you avoid the tensions and the trade-offs. But it's a very nice place in the middle to be, and that's an example of where you get low carbon, security, and lower costs.
Okay, thanks. Rob? The points again being made about the big six. I mean, I think that they do have something to answer in terms of innovation and the fact that their R&D budgets are so feeble. I think that the assumption has been that they will buy in innovation when somebody else does it, and I think that perhaps they should be a bit more proactive in that regard. But unfortunately, the bit of my speech I ran out of time before I got to say was about the fact that we need to be exploring new techniques, new ways of producing energy, because at the moment, this is in some ways part of the prevarication problem, is that there isn't really a nailed-on winner in terms of the future of energy. There are lots of possibilities out there, most of which will fall by the wayside because in one way or another they have a problem, but some of which will be successful. So for example, at the moment, one of the big ideas is carbon capture and storage. It's expensive at the moment. Canadians have just opened a plant to try it out, but it would be a way of being able to use coal and gas without the CO2 emissions or greatly reducing them. But at the moment it's expensive and non-commercial. Thorium reactors, again, one of the objections to nuclear weapons is that they can, the materials can be weaponized. But if thorium reactors, that would be extremely difficult, and there's a lot more thorium around than there is uranium, so that there's again potential for an exciting new future. But it could come to nothing as well. Same with fusion as well. Fusion's been attempted for it's always 30 years away, and it still seems to be 30 years away. But I mean that would be the absolute magic bullet if we could get that to work. It's temptation to always end up having a conversation about climate change when you want to have a discussion about energy. I mean, just to pick up on 2 points that Paul made. First of all, the 97% statistic. He kind of suggested that means that 97% of scientists think that this could be catastrophic. Whereas the question was, do you think human beings are having an influence on climate? And actually, most of the sensible, the worth taking seriously skeptics would be in the 97%, because most of them accept that actually human beings are having an effect on the climate. So that's, and secondly, in terms of talking about Hurricane Sandy and the Philippines, in terms of trends, in terms of extreme weather, it's much more contentious than you might think. And actually, in terms of hurricanes, for example, it's very difficult to see any trend in terms of hurricanes. So that whole debate is perhaps more open than Paul is suggesting. But even if you accept everything about that this is climate change is a very serious problem, it's the serious problem, you have to do something about it, that doesn't mean that our climate policy should be the immediate setting of targets and decarbonisation. It should be, in my opinion, it should be much more focused on innovation and ambition to try and find new ways in which we we can get the by holy trinity: cheapness, reliability, and abundance. Without, while still having, not having intermittency, having a reliable system that can be affordable and not, and with all the problems that high energy costs would cause.
Thanks very much, Rob. So I'm going to give the other three of you slightly less time this time round, just to make sure we get the audience in. And whilst I don't want to circumscribe anything that the debate's about, I don't want to turn it into a debate all about climate change. I want to try and keep the focus. So, Paul, please.
Yeah, I want to respond to the two gentlemen who, I think, put the argument where it ought to be. And it ought to be there on the subject of keeping the lights on, as well as on the subject of decarbonisation. And I'm talking about decarbonisation rather than climate change. This gentleman at the front, the gentleman at the back, who talked about risk. Because actually, this is all about managing risks. The unfortunate thing is that with regard to the decarbonisation issue, there is huge uncertainty about the risks. And of course, the climate scientists might be wrong. I go to bed every night hoping that they are. And I would wake up very happy if they, and someone would get a Nobel Prize, I can assure you of that, if the scientists were able to come up and show that actually the climate system has not been correctly modelled, and therefore there is not the need to decarbonise the energy system that we think there is over the timescale that we think we need to do it, and therefore we could go back to coal and gas with a clean conscience for future generations. And that point about 2050 not being far away, that of course is part of the problem. For you it's not far away, for me it's largely irrelevant, because I would be 100 in 2050, and I doubt I'm going to get there. But most importantly for politicians, it's 10 elections away. Well, 8 elections, 7 elections away. And 7 elections is rather a long time to be right.
Paul, I'm going to move the debate on now. Thank you.
Fine.
Was there any other point that you wanted to respond to briefly?
I suppose the only other thing I wanted to say was, we've heard a call for innovation. I love innovation. I spend a lot of my academic life studying it. And the problem is that at a certain level, innovation isn't about what happens in labs. Innovation and the learning that comes with it only happens when you put stuff out in the field and see whether it works and how it works. And that's an expensive business. That's what we've been doing with renewables over the last 15 or 20 years, and the prices of onshore wind and photovoltaics have come down enormously, by 80%. They wouldn't have come down if countries hadn't spent a lot of money actually putting them in the field, seeing how they worked, and then improve the manufacturing processes, etc. So I'm all for innovation, but innovation isn't necessarily cheap.
Thanks. Gemma, please.
I'm also all for innovation. And I think there is a cheaper form of innovation, which is where we start using data and we start using algorithms to help us to use the existing energy system smarter. And to your point at the back there, talking about 2050, your generation is the generation that can write code, that spends a lot of your time on social media. There was a review of the electricity market recently concluded by Ofgem that has allowed for consumers to band together to negotiate with the big 6 energy companies for a better deal. So it's possible to mass together using online platforms to say, okay, there's 10,000 of us, who wants our custom, who's going to offer us the best deal? There are huge opportunities in digital for using the existing system smarter and for shifting the power dynamics with the existing suppliers. It's not necessarily a painful thing to have to use energy at different points in the day. I think there seems to be a kind of implicit assumption that that's going to be a real hardship for people. There's a device called Nest that's recently, you've probably heard of, it's been bought by Google, that learns about your energy habits on your path and will help you to turn your appliances on and off, to adjust your thermostat according to your living habits in the home. That's just intelligent. It's just going to help you live better. It doesn't require sacrifice.
Thank you, Gemma. Paul, sorry, excuse me.
Short time, which to go for. Demand reduction, absolutely, and I'll sort of back up on that. completely what Keith said on the housing. Swedish engineer I was speaking to once told me that in the UK we build very good houses, they're just not suitable for the outdoors. We could do so much more on that, and that helps everybody. Demand reduction is a win-win, and actually being much smarter and managing the demand. To touch on the climate change thing and consensus, whatever, I think, as Murphy's Law said, the race isn't always to the swift or the fight to the strong, but that's the way to bet. They might be wrong, but there's too much evidence to suggest that we shouldn't be pushing. The problem, as he said, the downside risk. Do you do it unilaterally as a country, or do you do it globally? It's a global problem, we need a global agreement, and that is proving phenomenally difficult, and I don't really expect much from Copenhagen next year. So the EU, Paris next year, yeah. So the EU then have their targets to try to go together. The UK have actually pushed forward. One of the things the UK leads on is setting targets. We're very good at that. Delivering them is slightly different. The downside risk is if you go alone, you damage your economy. As you said, Germany and Denmark as well, who have pushed in renewables, have very high energy costs, whereas if you look at America, it was the abundance of new shale gas brought industry back. What would be really nice, if you look at Germany and Denmark, what they have done is build up huge industries in renewables, so they get back from that. They sell to the rest of the world. All the turbines we buy in this country, we've bought from mostly from Germany and Denmark. So we really should be looking, in terms of the innovation, what can the UK lead on? Now actually we're leading on offshore wind, and as expensive as it is a technology we could lead on and get value from down the line, exporting it. CCS is another one that I think could be really important. And Canada's ahead of us, but there's not many else. I think the UK, with 2 possible projects in Peterhead and Drax, could potentially lead the way on that. So we can drive decarbonisation and help the economy at the same time through innovating and doing it in the things we could take a global lead on.
Thanks, Alan. Right, I'm going to come to this side of the room first. I did kind of ignore this side of the room. So at the front, please, and then we'll work back, and then I'll get everybody else in.
I can't understand how it's in the interest of electricity generators to cause us to use less energy, which seems to me a great conundrum. I'd like to know what the economics are for money spent on reducing our consumption compared with money spent on building yet another power station. Simple example, near me recently was an idea for a straw burning power station. 4 megawatts, it would use 250,000 tons of straw a year. It would use all that diesel that was required to take the straw to the energy plant. If you imagine 250,000 tons used as an insulation within local housing projects, is that a much better use of time? I haven't worked it out. It would be interesting if we got a comment from everybody on the panel there about is that a better way of spending our money?
Thank you. Some quick economic calculations there, please, panel. We can pass the microphone to this gentleman here, and then we'll go to the lady over there. And I will get to the other side.
Yeah, there's regards to talking really long term, there's been a lot about climate change and what it's going to be in the next 30 to 40 years. Beyond that, even more I'd say it's a bigger issue of talking about security of fuel. I'm not entirely sure what the latest figures are, but oil and coal aren't going to last forever on a sphere. There's only so much material in our Earth. Regards to long term, surely we should be focusing on the security that we're going to be competing with China and America, with developing economies for these scarce resources. Surely that's going to drive up the price way beyond renewables, etc.
Thank you. And the lady over there, I think, is also operating the camera view.
I just wanted to make a comment, really, with this idea of what if the climate scientists are wrong, then that would make things so much more simple. We could just continue to rely on coal and fossil fuels. But it ignores a huge body of scientific evidence linking coal in particular, but fossil fuel energy in general to health, primarily through outdoor air pollution. And so the path of decarbonisation has the potential to deliver massive health savings and reduce premature mortality, disease burdens, and big economic savings to the healthcare system. So I would make the argument that the considerations of what are the risks, which paths to pursue, needs to be cast quite broadly, which obviously makes things more complicated, but health is an important dimension to that.
Okay, thanks very much. Then coming over this side then, suddenly a sea of hands. This lady at the front who's been very patient.
Am I too near that?
Maybe. Try it again.
Okay, Brett. I can name more gays and lesbians in the House of Commons than I can scientists and engineers, but I've keep on being turned down for bodies like Committee on Radioactive Waste Management and Ofgem. I'll start by telling the EU where to go. They might have got these funny new light bulbs. We have to switch more on in order to be able to see. The EU is a block to business and to innovation. Decarbonisation. It puts green taxes and VAT on the littler people, on their domestic fuel bills, ignoring merchant shipping. Now, the French school children are taken around the nuclear power station, which may colour their views. But I don't want the French over here. I want to build British power stations with nuclear or coal, if necessary with a state subsidy. Meanwhile, I suggest you switch off the street lamps, reduce the population and plant more trees. What would you do about the non-static stuff, like aircraft? My innovation, a nuclear-powered merchant fleet. I've worked on submarines, and I've walked across Hiroshima, and I don't glow in the dark.
Thank you very much. And then if you can pass it back, please. Yes, the gentleman there, Brandon.
Hi there. We've heard mention of the falling price of photovoltaics and a few other areas of technology innovation. But I'm curious, on a 30 to 40 year view, where are the exponentials? Because I suspect that if we look at everything just linearly and extrapolate from where we are now, we'll probably miss a couple of important technology trends. Now, it could be in batteries, it could be in Lockheed Martin's proposed fusion reactor they announced the other day. It could well be various aspects of wind, but where are we going to see a curve rather than a straight line?
Thanks. Actually, that gentleman there just in front, please, with the blue shirt.
Hi. My question is about infrastructure, about the UK infrastructure, and if it's going to be available for the target of 2080. I mean, is it going to support all that renewable energy? And if it not, what's the UK going to do about it?
Okay, thanks. And there's a lady at the back, please.
As Alan said, it's a global problem and we all have to do it together, but I wonder what the panel thinks about individual consumer responsibility. Gemma mentioned about smart technologies helping us to understand, and I think perhaps there isn't a need for consumer education as such, because we all know how we can save energy, make less journeys and things like that. But I think maybe there's a certain amount of individual responsibility and laziness that we all have, and we're all guilty of. And whether you feel that if we did all start to take more responsibility for ourselves, whether we would then take that through to our own workplaces, whether we work in an office or in a power station. I know myself, Gemma mentioned about technologies, I discovered that I could save a third on my energy bills just by turning off my TV at the wall. And so for the last year I've saved a third by that one simple action every night. And I wonder how many of us actually bother to do these things.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, just to warn the panel, because time's running on, I'm going to take the last few points from the audience, and then in your responses, you're also going to give your concluding statement. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes each, timed, to choose what you're going to respond to and to leave us your final comments, okay? Right, on this side, who hasn't spoken that wanted to speak? This gentleman at the front. And anybody on this side, if you want to speak, raise your hand.
I think there's a tension in the discussion which Gemma put her finger on when she mentioned the word sacrifice. What I would like to kind of get to the bottom of or explore is what's the difference between regulating demand and sacrifice? Is not kind of regulating demand just a euphemism in a sense for the idea of sacrifice, giving up things? What's the difference between those two ideas? Is there one? Can you draw out that tension a bit more?
Okay. And then there's a gentleman over here. Just there. And that's the last one.
Hi there. With respect to innovation and getting things into the field, I wanted to ask if there was any prospects for experimentation in the nuclear energy, if there's any chance of investing in new kinds and improving the effectiveness and the cost of nuclear energy.
Thank you very much. Nice and short and sweet, as they say. Right. Alan, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. To this gentleman, money on reducing demand, how does it affect? Go and look at marginal abatement curves. They will show you all of the measures or technologies and how much they cost. The demand side generally tend to be the cheapest and the most effective before you get to the high technology things. So the information is out there, and the low-hanging fruit is there for everyone to see, and we're not doing it. And that's one of the most disappointing things. Fuel scarcity was a real worry up until sort of 2/3 of the way through 2008, when oil was $140 a barrel. Since then, shale gas has come along. The unfortunate thing is the world is not short of hydrocarbons. It is awash with hydrocarbons. They're getting harder to get out of the ground, but they are there. And how we get to the point of not using them is really difficult. Pollution is definitely very important, but I think that's a mixture of, there's decarbonisation, which is really hard, and then there's sustainability, which is even harder. And tying up all that together is really difficult. The exponentials, it's the exponentials and the unknowns, really. Shale gas was an unknown that no one saw coming. I think actually it's the digital side is probably, the Gemma's been talking about, is probably the really big changer, actually, rather than a particular technology. Sacrifice is that just another word for, sort of for demand reduction. You can look at it two ways. Are you getting the same service for less energy? Is one of, so that's the insulating your homes. People don't want to buy gas. They want their home to be warm. You can get the same level of warmth with a much lower amount of gas or fuel. That's what you're aiming for. Okay, so you can do things like that. Individual responsibility and laziness. Yes, that's my final point. It is all up to you. It's all your fault so far. So please get on into it. To some extent, you know, as I said, the big six have been demonised. I think DEC and the government get it from all sides, but we do absolutely have a personal responsibility, and we all have to be part of the solution.
Right. So we'll go home and feel bad about it. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Alan. Keith, please.
Yeah, I just think on that point, a belief that we will find ways of influencing behaviour changes in 25 million households from 60 million people is a little bit fanciful, and I think that one of the biggest areas to look at for innovation and change on the demand side is in automation and aggregation rather than in individual behaviour change. Just sort of going way up, sort of a more general point that's come up a number of times. I think so much of this debate is about risk and reward, risk apportionment. Who's best to take the risk is generally the person who's best able to manage it. And at the moment we've been going the wrong way around that we're taking away market risk from people who are able to manage market risk, and we're replacing it with political risk, which people shouldn't be exposed to and aren't able to do that. And it's particularly true in innovation. Risk is important in innovation. It is a risky business. If you innovate, you're probably going to do 10 things and you maybe be lucky if one of them comes off. So one of the problems for the utility companies is their investors are pension funds. You know, having recently taken early retirement, pensions have suddenly taken on a new dimension for me. So I don't want my pension fund investing in a company that is taking great big risks. because I want a nice, steady return. And that's what utility companies are generally there for. In some ways, they're a proxy for the steady returns, the lower risks for pensioners, and that isn't a good environment to be looking for the best form of innovation. And just take one of the examples where a lot of the utilities have invested a lot in innovation, and SSE, who I work for, became the #2 developer of offshore wind in the world. Only this March, having to pull out of virtually all the offshore activities because of changes in policy, changes in ambition and aspiration, and wrote off £100 million in the accounts at the end of last year. Now, that is an expensive way of learning. And what have we learned? Nothing about offshore wind, all about mistrusting the government.
Thank you very much indeed. Rob?
To come back to an earlier point, like everybody else, I wouldn't take the chance of assuming that, or betting that the scientists might be wrong, even if I have some suspicions about some of the wilder claims made about climate change. I think we should decarbonise as long as it's cost effective, or it's a no regrets decarbonisation. So I mean, putting wind turbines where they're close to being cost competitive, it's a very sensible thing to do. You get a lot of field experience from that. You'll learn how to reduce the price of wind power or solar power through those things, and actually throwing subsidy at them in such a way that they get used in places where they're not very effective is actually bad news for renewables, because it creates a climate in which people have become cynical about them. And in terms of no regrets, battery operated cars seem to be a very sensible thing to do regardless of what happens to the climate, because actually local noise and pollution from internal combustion engines is a bit of a problem in cities. Go to the third world and see all those diesel engines, the air is brown with it. The sooner we can get cost-effective electric cars, the better. So I think that's right. I don't think we should be thinking about demand management, although I think we should lower our horizons about what demand management's going to do. A, because there's limitations to it, and B, because of rebound effects. Like as people spend less on energy because they're getting more bangs from their book from their LED lights or whatever, they tend to leave the LED lights on longer. So you don't get necessarily the savings you're expecting. Although the woman at the back with her very, very expensive television standby, I mean, what kind of a television is it? In terms of aircraft, biofuels, I think it's one area where biofuels would make actually some sense. But I think in general, my closing comment is more ambition, more innovation. We don't need to panic about climate change to the extent that we throw money at the problem. We can do it much more smarter and decarbonise the economy in the long run. And they're throwing leaves at me now as well.
Thank you, Rob. Paul?
Yeah, thanks. It's been great. So thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry I can't address more than a tiny proportion of them. On the energy efficiency one, which I'm not sure anyone else has addressed, yeah, I mean, this is one of the really big conundrums. All the technical analysis that we do in the department that I work at university suggests that there are huge gains to be got from energy efficiency, but it seems to be politically and institutionally really difficult actually to do it. Actually to get householders in their homes, which are their castles, to make the investments that will save them money. Different countries do this in different ways. The UK has made progress over the last 15 years if you look at the quantity of energy being used by households, but it's difficult and the politicians have a lot of scars on their backs from having tried to achieve it. Individual roles and responsibilities, clearly I think individuals are important, but this isn't going to be solved by individuals. This is a collective action problem. This is something we need to work on in our communities, with our local authorities, in our national governments, in the EU, and at the global level, and we've got to do all of that. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult, because actually we don't work together terribly well over these big, long-term, difficult timescales. And I'm going to finish on this issue of downsides, with this issue that was raised by the lady with the health benefits of decarbonisation, because the worst that would happen if we decarbonise and then it turns out we didn't need to, well, all the evidence suggests that we would lose less economically than we lost in the financial crisis. So that's kind of the worst down the line. That's bad. I'm not saying that that's good, that's bad, but it's not catastrophic. And the worst that might happen on the climate end is catastrophic, and all climate scientists think that there is a small probability or a larger probability of doing that. And the benefits, if we get the climate thing wrong, is we have renewables, which are cheaper than they would otherwise be, which are free at the point of use, and which are homegrown, and we get all the health benefits that that lady was talking about, and indeed that Rob talked about, and we've clearly got a point of agreement there at last, which is great.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And finally, Gemma.
On this point about the economics of demand response, I don't have the figures at my fingertips around that. The point I wanted to make there was more about the speed at which clever demand response is possible versus the speed at which you can build new energy supply. Demand response and energy efficiency is not a substitute for new energy supply, but it's a really important part of making the transition, an important part of the investment, and a way to manage the need for that further investment taking place. And because it's happening so quickly, and because the pace of innovation in the digital space is so fast, think about where we've come in the past 5 years, there's incredible potential there. On this point about consumer responsibility, of course there is an onus on all of us to be using energy in smarter ways, but the system that we're operating within our homes is just a bit broken. And so we need a redesign of that system. We can't just change our behaviour and expect that that's going to be a solution in itself. Loughborough University have done some ethnographic research recently, just looking at people's energy habits. And one of the stories that stood out for me is that one of the big inefficiencies in homes is that people don't dry their laundry outside in the garden so much anymore. They use tumble dryers, which are really energy intensive, or they're drying it on racks in their home. So they need to have enough through draft in the home and heat to be able to dry those clothes. So they stick the heating on and they open all the windows in order to dry their clothes. And that's just an example of the way we use energy at home is just a bit broken. We need a redesign, and that comes back to one of the points made earlier on. What we need is a system where we're not buying units of electricity, units of energy, we're buying warmth, like we're buying the service of being warm in our homes. We're buying the service of having hot water when we need it, and ensuring that the arrangements are there to make that possible for us. Finally, this is our energy system. You know, I think before I worked at Forum, I thought of this as being something that was done to me by other people. Investments that are being made quite far off in the future, or far off from me, geographically speaking. There's an onus on us, if we want something different and better, to use the powers at our disposal to create that. And which comes back to my point, the two guys sitting on the floor at the back there who don't realise I'm now talking about that we have huge potential using digital platforms to engage with the big six and to make ourselves heard and just to build something that's better.
Thank you very much to all of our panel for a really, I think, very measured and interesting debate, but with plenty of differences of opinions on the panel. So thank you. Round of applause.